Today's video is on the top 5 largest companies in history.
Number 5. Standard Oil. Standard Oil was an American oil and gas company founded in 1870 in Ohio by John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler. The company became the largest oil refinery of its time. It was also one of the first and largest multinational corporations in the world. The company controlled as much as 90% of the oil in America in the early 20th century. Back then, oil was not only the cornerstone of the emerging car industry, but also the main light source for lamps since electricity still wasn't widely available. So in 1911, the US Supreme Court ruled that the company was an illegal monopoly and had to split into 34 smaller companies. This didn't hurt Rockefeller at all. The shares of the new 34 companies were worth more than Standard Oil was, and his wealth increased to $400 billion. Or 2% of the entire US GDP, making him the richest man in the world. As for the 34 new companies, its successors, such as ExxonMobil or Chevron, have grown into some of the richest companies in the world today. Number 4. Saudi Aramco. Still around today, Saudi Aramco was founded by the Standard Oil Company in California in 1933. Aramco actually stands for Arabian American Oil Company. The Saudi government granted it a concession, and 5 years later, oil was found. Other US companies joined in, and pipelines were opened throughout the region. The company was eventually forced to share their profits with the Saudi Arabian government, which gradually took over the control. And so, the oil production of the country was effectively nationalized, and the company was renamed into Saudi Aramco in 1988. Today, the company is one of the biggest oil producers in the world, and one of the largest companies in the world by revenue. In 2018, it was the most profitable company in the entire world, making more than 4 times the profits of other oil industry competitors. But its wealth is no surprise, given that it owns the second largest crude oil reserves in the world, managing over 100 oil and gas fields in Saudi Arabia. Number 3. The South Sea Company. The South Sea Company was an 18th century British joint venture that was granted a monopoly over trade with South America and reached a value of $4.3 trillion in today's money. The company's purpose was supposed to have been trade, mainly of slaves, with the Spanish colonies in America. The company's shares sold well, counting various prominent figures amongst its investors, including even Sir Isaac Newton, who bought around 22,000 euros worth of its stock. It was also supported by the promotion of the government, and King George I becoming its governor in 1718. But all this was highly speculative. Even its objective of trading with the Spanish colonies was dependent on the outcome of the War of the Spanish Succession, which ended up imposing more limitations than it was predicted. 2 years later, the company was allowed to take over the national debt, and the value of their stock soared even further. But the speculation inevitably collapsed within the same year, dragging government stock down with them and ruining countless investors. An inquiry was ordered by the House of Commons, and it was revealed that at least 3 ministers had accepted bribes and speculated. A public scandal ensued, along with half-fulfilled promises of indicting responsible parties, while the South Sea Company sold most of its right to the Spanish government in 1750 and survived up until the middle of the 19th century. Number 2. The Mississippi Company. The Mississippi Company was another 18th century company founded by a Scottish economist named John Law. John Law was friends with the regent of France, who initially made him his financial advisor. The depressed state of the French economy, caused by years of reckless spending by Louis XIV, allowed for the quick rise of figures like John Law, who brought new monetary and economic ideas to the table. And so, Law was able to convince the French government to let him open a bank and start the Mississippi Company, which consolidated the trading companies of the French colony of Louisiana into a single monopoly. The company was given exclusive trading privileges in the area for 25 years and had total control over trade between France and all territories outside of Europe. Law used effective marketing schemes to exaggerate the wealth of Louisiana and incite wild speculation on the company's shares. His strategy was a success, and the Mississippi Company's shares quickly skyrocketed in value. Citizens from all over France and Europe jumped at what seemed like a golden investment opportunity. The shares' prices increased by a crazy 1,900% in less than a year, and the company's value temporarily rised to today's equivalent of $6.5 trillion. Even working-class people were investing whatever money they could find in hopes of joining the increasing number of newly made millionaires. Less than a year later, the bubble bursts, and people massively try to convert the notes issued by Law's bank into coins, which ultimately led the bank closing down and Law fleeing to the Netherlands. It took France a while before it managed to recover from the financial crisis that came out of the entire affair, and the bubble was one of the main reasons behind the overseas French Empire falling into British hands. Number 1. The Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a megacorporation established with the help of the Dutch government by joining several rival Dutch companies in the early 17th century. It was also one of the first companies that issued bonds and shares of stock to the general public, making it the world's first formally listed public company. Even though it was established 400 years before the rise of capitalism, the Dutch East India Company was operating successfully as a global capitalist business throughout the 17th and 18th century, and it's often considered to be the forerunner of modern corporations. The company started out as a shipping enterprise, with the Dutch government granting it a 21-year monopoly for the spice trade in Asia. Then it expanded to every possible aspect of the spice trade, from production to consumer sales, while it still kept its dominance in the shipping industry for over 100 years. It established an immensely profitable trade corridor between Europe and Asia and sent over 1 million voyagers to Asian countries, more than the rest of Europe combined. The company had entire armadas of ships under its control and the power to defeat navies and conquer territories. It eventually financed the conquest of Indonesia and recruited European, Japanese, Indian, and Indonesian mercenaries. It wasn't only the pioneer of global trade, it established an entire empire. Indonesia remained under the rule of the Dutch East India Company for the next 200 years, and only in the beginning of the 19th century, the Dutch proclaimed it as a national colony. In these 200 years, the company itself transformed into a corporate entity to a company state, an empire in its own right. All of this, of course, came at a price. The company was heavily reliant on worker exploitation, imprisonment, and the slave trade. It reached its peak in 1637 during the Tulip Mania in Holland, the world's first financial bubble. The company was worth $7.9 trillion in modern currency at the time. The company slowly declined during the end of the 18th century as a result of the socio-economic changes in Europe, less successful financial management, and the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. It was nationalized in 1796 and dissolved 3 years later, and all of its assets and territories were taken over by the Dutch government. Honorable mentions: the British East India Company. The British East India Company was a company formed in the 17th century to trade in the area of the Indian Ocean, initially with Mughal India and the East Indies, and later with Qing China. Its business quickly grew to the point of accounting for a huge amount of the world's trade, according to some accounts, as much as half of the global trade, especially in commodities like cotton, silk, indigo dye, salt, spices, tea, and most notoriously, opium. In fact, the East India Company was, along with the British government, the main culprit behind the Opium Wars. During the first half of the 19th century, the company was making a fortune out of its opium exports to China. China started suffering economically and socially because of the alarming increase of addiction, and the Chinese government finally issued a ban on drug trafficking. The British drug merchants continued smuggling opium anyway, supported by the government, so the Chinese had to start confiscating and destroying the illegal drug cargoes. This made Britain declare war on China in order to secure its interests and ensure free drug trade, and 2 opium wars later, the Chinese were forced to comply. Much like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company developed into a powerful political force and a key instrument in the expansion of its country's empire. It became a crucial instrument of British colonization, taking over large parts of India and colonizing Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. The Indian subcontinent was conquered by its mercenary army, after which the British continued to rule the area for about a century with a huge military force of up to 350,000 soldiers. The army of the British monarchy itself didn't come close to this number. Unsurprisingly, the British Crown eventually nationalized both the conquered Indian territory and the company's private army in 1858. By that time, the company was already in steep decline that started nearing the end of the 18th century as more and more regulatory measures were established by the government, until it finally ceased to exist as a legal entity in 1873.
I hope you all enjoyed today's video, narrated by Zach this time. Be sure to subscribe for more and check out some of our recent uploads.